Judas spent 3 years walking with Jesus, eating with him, watching him heal people, hearing every word he ever said. He was there for all of it. And then one night, he handed Jesus over to be arrested for money. Or was it really just for money? Because the more I try to understand the story, the more I realized the answer is so much more than that. And honestly, more relatable than most of us want to admit. So I had to research deeper. If you're trying to understand the Bible in a simple and honest way, not through complicated theology, just honest exploration, consider subscribing. That's what this channel is. Just someone trying to figure this out. One verse or one story at a time. Let's start from the beginning. Because to understand what Judas did, we have to understand who he really was. Judas Iscariot was one of the 12 disciples. That means he was handpicked by Jesus himself. Not randomly selected, not forced into the group. Jesus looked at him and said, "You, come follow me." That's a significant thing to hold on to. He wasn't someone who snuck into the inner circle. He was invited by Jesus himself, and for 3 years, he was fully part of it. He traveled with Jesus, listened to his teachings, witnessed miracles firsthand, the feeding of thousands, the healing of the blind. He saw and witnessed all of it. And here's the part that makes his story even more striking. Judas was trusted. Among the 12, he was the one who held the group's money. He was essentially their treasurer. If you don't trust someone, you don't give them the finances. So, whatever the disciples thought of each other, Judas held a position of real responsibility. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't an outsider who turned on Jesus from a distance. He was someone close, someone trusted, someone who was very committed. That's what makes the betrayal so unsettling every time I come back to this story. Now let's walk through what actually happened, because sometimes we've heard this story so many times that we actually stop feeling it. It happens during the last week of Jesus' life. Tensions in Jerusalem are high. The religious leaders, the chief priests, and the elders are looking for a way to arrest Jesus quietly. They're afraid of how the crowds respond to him. They want to move carefully, but they need someone on the inside. And then Judas comes to them in an unexpected manner. In the Gospel of Matthew it says, he went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" And they promised him 30 pieces of silver. It's worth pausing on that number, because 30 pieces of silver at that time was roughly the price of a slave. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't the kind of sum you'd expect someone to throw their entire life away for. And I think that detail matters. We'll come back to it. Judas takes the money and starts waiting for the right moment. That moment comes at night in a garden called Gethsemane. Jesus had gone there to pray with his disciples nearby, but only Judas was not there. It was quiet. It was late. And then Judas arrived with a group of soldiers and officials sent by the chief priests. Now here's the detail that no matter how many times I read it, still lands heavily. The signal Judas had given the soldiers was this: "Whoever I kiss, that's the man. Arrest him." A kiss was a normal greeting between close friends at the time, a sign of affection, of respect. And Judas used that. He walked up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus looked at him and said, "Do what you came to do." And honestly, that was so heartbreaking, because he already knew it. That's it. No rage, no long speech, just do what you came to do. Jesus was arrested, the disciples scattered, and just like that, Something irreversible had happened. Let's dive deeper. Why did he really do it? Most people, when they hear Judas betrayed Jesus, immediately land on, he did it for the money. And yes, money is part of it. The text says it plainly. But I've started to wonder whether money was really the root of it, or whether it was just the final transaction at the end of a much longer internal journey. If Judas was purely motivated by greed, 30 pieces of silver seems low. This is someone who had been traveling with the most talked about figure in the region for 3 years. If pure profit was the goal, he could have negotiated harder. He could have waited. He could have found a better offer. So maybe money was the mechanism. But was it the motivation? I don't think it fully explains it. At the time, Jewish people living under Roman rule were desperate for a liberator. They had been waiting for a Messiah. But in their minds, a Messiah looked a certain way. He would be powerful, political, military. He would rise up, confront the empire, and restore Israel to its former glory. And that was the expectation many people carried. And Judas, like many others, may have walked into this relationship with Jesus carrying that same picture in his head. At first, it probably seemed to fit. Jesus was drawing massive crowds. He spoke with authority that silenced religious leaders. He had power, real, undeniable power. For someone hoping for a revolution, Jesus might have seemed like exactly what they were waiting for. But then, over time, something kept not happening. Jesus talked about forgiveness, not warfare. He touched lepers instead of building armies. He said the meek will inherit the earth instead of the strong will take it back. He kept talking about a kingdom that wasn't of this world. For someone expecting something specific, that has to be disorienting, maybe even frustrating. I've thought about this a lot because I think we've all experienced the feeling of expecting something from someone, really truly expecting it, and then slowly realizing they're not going to deliver it in the way you imagined. Some historians and theologians have suggested that Judas may have handed Jesus over, not to destroy him, but to trigger something, to back Jesus into a corner where he would finally have to act, where he would reveal the power Judas believed was there, waiting, where the revolution would finally begin. If that's true, and we can't know for certain, then Judas wasn't betraying Jesus out of hatred. He was betraying him out of misplaced expectation. He had built a version of Jesus in his mind that didn't match the real one, and that gap became a tragedy. Here's the layer I find most personal, because it's the one that applies to people who aren't disciples of anyone, people who are just human. It's the question of how someone gets to that point, because Judas didn't wake up one morning as a perfectly loyal follower and then suddenly decide to betray Jesus. That's not how these things work. Internal shifts like this, the kind that lead to irreversible decisions, they happen gradually, quietly, through small moments that don't seem like much at the time. Small compromises, small doubts that were never spoken, small disappointments that were never resolved, a growing numbness, a slow drift. We know from the Gospels that Judas was dishonest with the money he managed. The Gospel of John mentions that he would steal from the group's funds. That's a small thing in isolation, a private thing, something no one might notice for a long time. But it tells you something about the interior life of someone who was outwardly committed and inwardly drifting. And honestly, And I say this with no judgment, because I've seen this in myself too. That's one of the most human things in this entire story. The distance between who we present ourselves to be and who we're actually becoming in the quiet moments when no one is watching. That gap. Most of us know what that feels like, at least a little bit. This part always made me think, not about Judas specifically, but about how easy it is to be around something good, something meaningful, and still not really be in it. Judas was with Jesus for 3 years, and somewhere along the way, he was also gone. Now let's talk about what happened after, and I think it's one of the most important parts. After Jesus was arrested, and it became clear what was happening, that Jesus was going to be condemned, not crowned, something broke in Judas. The Gospel of Matthew says that when Judas saw that Jesus had been condemned, he was filled with remorse. He went back to the chief priests and the elders and tried to undo it. He threw the 30 pieces of silver back at them. He said, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." He knew it was innocent blood. He said it himself. And the religious leaders, the ones who had used him, who had needed him, looked back at him and said, essentially, "That's your problem, not ours." The money was thrown onto the temple floor. I've always found the image of those coins on the floor to be one of the most haunting details in the entire story. Everything he had done, everything he had given up, reduced to 30 coins on a stone floor, and no one picking them up. What happened next? Judas left, and he couldn't find a way forward. I want to be careful here, and I want to be gentle, because this is a moment of profound human collapse, not a villain's ending, not a satisfying conclusion to a story about wickedness, just a person who made a catastrophic choice, who understood what he had done, who tried to reverse it and couldn't, and who broke under the weight of that. There's grief in that, real grief. The same gospel that records this also records Jesus hours later on a cross, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." The question of whether that included Judas in its scope, I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does fully, but I find myself wondering, so what do we take from all of this? I've been sitting with this story for a long time, and the conclusion I keep coming back to is not a tidy one. It's more of a question I carry with me. What if betrayal doesn't start in one single moment? What if it builds slowly, through unspoken disappointments, through expectations that never get examined, through the quiet distance we allow to grow between ourselves and the things we say we believe? Maybe Judas isn't the villain of a simple cautionary tale. Maybe he's something more complicated, a mirror, a reflection of what happens when we follow something for the wrong reasons, or expect it to be something it never was, and then never honestly reckon with that gap. I used to see this story very differently. I used to read Judas as purely the bad guy, the obvious warning, the one who chose wrong. And that reading isn't entirely incorrect. He did make choices, real choices with real consequences. But now I see more in it. I see a person who started in the same place as the others, who walked the same roads, who heard the same words, and whose internal drift, slow, private, unaddressed, led somewhere none of them would have predicted at the beginning. And that makes me look inward, more than outward, when I read this story. How many times do we come to faith, or come back to faith, with a specific idea of what we wanted to give us? What we want God to do or be, or fix. And how often do we quietly, without ever admitting it to ourselves, start pulling back when the reality doesn't match that picture? The gap between the God we imagine and the God who actually shows up in the Bible, that gap can be unsettling. I know it has been for me, because the Bible's God doesn't always behave the way we'd script him. He doesn't always arrive the way we expect. He doesn't always save people in the way they wanted to be saved. And if we never honestly sit with that discomfort, if we never bring that disappointment into the open and actually examine it, it can quietly do a lot of damage over time. Maybe that's the deepest lesson in Judas's story. Not don't be greedy, not don't betray people, but be honest about what you actually believe and why. Look at the gap between your expectations and reality. Don't let it grow silently. I don't walk away from this story with judgment toward Judas. Honestly, I can't. Because the more carefully I look at him, the more I recognize pieces of something familiar. The wanting to control how things turn out. The slow drift that happens when things don't go the way you planned. The decisions made from a place of disappointment rather than clarity. He was human. He was complicated. And the story of his end is genuinely one of the saddest in the Gospels. Not because it's graphic, but because it's so final, so irreversible. There was no restoration, no reconciliation, just the weight of something that couldn't be undone. And yet the other disciples, men who also ran, who also denied, who also failed, they found their way back. The difference wasn't the failure. It was what happened after it. Thank you for spending this time with me. This is one of those stories I'll keep returning to, I think. Because it has layers I'm still finding. If this gave you something to think about, if it helped you see a familiar story a little differently, I'd love for you to subscribe and continue this journey with me. We're just getting started. There's so much more to explore, and I'd rather not do it alone. See you in the next one.